I'm John Stanmeyer. I'm one of the founding members of the 7 Photo Agency. I've been a photographer for probably about 20 to almost 30 years. I'm a social documentarian. I work lately for National Geographic primarily, but I work for numerous other publications around the world. I was on contract with Time magazine for over 10 years, and I'm a farmer, and I'm a father. Photography allows you to have self-exploration, but then it naturally evolves into the greater element of societal explorations and who we are in this fascinating fabric called humanity and the issues that are connected to all of that, which inevitably are social, whether they're of joy and happiness or simplicity or complacency or anger, rage, and war. That is ironic, the makeup of the human fabric. And on the negative side, the war side, the darker side, it's also very much the weaker side of humanity. I think a lot of photographers, rightfully so, want to make change. But I would argue not against that, completely for that, but if we can't, as a society, stop the madness that we're doing based upon the enormous level of recorded visuals and text, will change actually happen? I think it's incremental. I think if you can change the consciousness of one, or if somehow a story that you do helps a family, an individual, a village, to have change that they themselves can't muster the myriad layers of trying to make change themselves, then you've done something more than doing nothing. When I do these global stories, for example, the food crisis, the story title was The End of Plenty. I think there was 9 countries, it was every continent except Europe. And I look at it in a way, it's like a quilt or a carpet, that even though there's different designs and feelings and energies across this carpet, they all are connected to the same carpet. It connects us globally the same way that the carpet you're walking on, if there's 5 people standing on it, we're all connected to that carpet. Because again, what happens when flooding happens in Iowa affects food and grain prices clear across the other side of the planet. When forests are cut down in the Amazon, changes weather pattern in the Horn of Africa. When we drive more and more fossil fuel burning cars, it changes weather pattern, whether we want to admit it or not. I was just at a garden shop over the weekend, and the resident green thumb said that plants are blooming at the most erratic rate that he's ever seen. This isn't normal. What is it? It's not me necessarily to say, but I can show you visually that things connect. And when you see them, you can't dispute them. And when I do these stories for the Geographic, I look at them almost as if you're doing your doctoral thesis. And the way it's done at the Geographic is very much like that, and they've been doing this for decades. That you, of course, present your story, you do a story pitch, and then you hope it's approved. And then you go out and you do the story in 2 pieces. So you go out for the food story, I think that was 10 or 11 weeks. Quite long, because nowadays it's slightly shorter just because it's so expensive to do these stories. But you go out and you do 4 weeks, 5 weeks, and then you come back and you do a midway presentation. You go to Washington, D.C., and you enter a room, dark room. You spend a lot of time editing with brilliant editors, and you do what's called a midway show or a midway tray. We still call them a tray, even though it's all digitally. It still goes under the terminology of a slide tray. And you literally present where you're at. And in many ways, you're starting to do what I would consider defending your thesis. And that's actually at a point that the Geographic could say, well, this story isn't working, we're going to stop it. Because some stories just don't work. But then, hopefully, it worked, and then you go out and you do your second part of the story, another 4 weeks, 5 weeks. And then you come back and you really have to defend. You enter a room, the hallowed halls of the Geographic, and everyone from the society, the art department, maps, research department, your editor, about 30 people in a room come in and you present what you just spent 10, 8, 12 weeks doing. And I literally see it as defending or presenting your doctoral thesis, because so much goes in to doing this work, especially, again, under the research, to do massive global stories. Another way of looking at doing really any long-term story, I like to look at it as if you're composing music, or you're trying to lace together a narrative, a visual narrative, the same way as you'd listen to a musical score. You'll hear in music a bit of violins playing and an oboe maybe quietly receding, and then there'll be a build-up, and there'll be a moaning, droning cello, and then drop off again, and then timpanis will roar and come back down again, and it all comes together as an audible composition when you start writing that score. When you take, these hundreds or thousands of pictures and you try to put it into a visual stream, a visual narrative, it reminds me of music. When I can grab a hold of that beat or that rhythm that's playing out in a story, I find then that I can continue that rhythm even though I change geographic locations. I like to have humans in my pictures. I'm a human. I'm intrigued by humans. And looking at volcano spirituality was looking at what the Indonesians, or especially the Balinese considered a volcano to be the navel of the earth, the belly button of the earth. I mean, fantastic, wow. And it is, it is the belly button to the life force that this earth is. It's a living organism. It's spinning, my God, it's just flabbergasting. I think a key thing is I have to be very, very hard to myself, and I see it in a lot of other photo essays from other photographers, is needing to edit tighter. You have to tell a story and not just say, these are all my favorite pictures, look at them, aren't they great? That when you do a story like this on Sacred Water, it inevitably connects to events. Sacred Water was I'd say, 10% photography, 20% research, and 70% logistics. How do you go around the planet in what was a bit of a narrow time frame? I think I only had about 6 months to do this story, and make it where you have human beings interacting with it. If you're not there for that day of the event, it happened at night, it'll just be a beautiful waterfall. And I want to have human beings in the images. This is a story about how humans interact for their spiritual thirst. I think subconsciously, while I'm working, I'm aware of layers. We have to remember that photography is a very sort of narrow view of the world. It is a boxed perspective. It's not wide, dynamic, even in a panorama. It broadens the scope, but there's still things happening behind you that you hear. I'm very much intrigued by sound. I do a lot of field recordings just for myself. I've been doing audio recordings for 20-some years. So the best that I can do within this, in some ways, limited frame is to bring in layers or different visual points of messages. From an art perspective, I appreciate and value art endlessly. I came from this background in art and fashion, but I left that realm not by leaving art. There's total art in journalism, but I don't want the art to become the leading part of it. I want the issue that I'm photographing to be screaming at you. When you're dealing in a famine or a hunger, most of the time these people can't leave. There's this invisible line that only humans create. It's called a border, and elephants and butterflies and ants can crawl over it, and birds can fly over it, but human beings, unless you have this thing called a passport, can't. And I don't want to have my interests or about me to be playing any part in that image. Now, if there's, issues of composition that play out of what I do, I don't necessarily overly think about it. I try not to overly stylize things. I don't like extreme burning or color saturating or what have you. I understand it, I respect it. Some people do it really well. I just want it to be as pure and untouched as possible. For a young photographer, or really any photographer, some brilliant photographers are photographers who, had this urge or calling or need when they're in their 30s, 40s, or 50s. So any photographer, I suggest read as much as you can, feel as much as you can, taste as much as you can, listen to as much as you can of anything. Whether it's poetry or whether it's news or whether it's fiction or nonfiction, observe, be intrigued by everything. Be fascinated by how the light changes. Be intrigued by that and try to find maybe some layers or a story or an issue or a feeling from it that can be turned into photographs.